Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another training for professionals, people who support the refugees from Ukraine in those dramatic times of war. We keep learning not to be indifferent and inactive. It's not easy to find yourself in such traumatic situation and find your understanding of the stressful and difficult situation, but still we want very much, especially in this program of the Academy of Motivation and Education for Ukraine, we try to get everyone familiar with what those affected by the war might be going through, those who suffer from the war directly. And today, in our series of lectures and trainings, we have a great pleasure of welcoming an extraordinary specialist on anxiety disorders in CBT, David Clark from Canada, who has been very supportive from the very beginning. Once we mentioned our undertaking, I would really like to appreciate your involvement, no matter what you say, David. This is really helpful that you're here with us. And today I understand we're going to talk about the role of all kinds of factors related to mental health in the context of trauma and catastrophes that people are going through. So thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you for sharing, for dedicating your time to this difficult issue and to us. So yes, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Igra. And let me start by saying it's a great honor to be with you and to participate in this program or this initiative, which Iga and her staff have, and her colleagues, I should say, have put together. You know, these are extraordinary times, tragic times, and you know, I can certainly say, as for myself personally, I think also for most Canadians, and I'm going to say probably for CBT therapists around the world, that we do stand for Ukraine. And, you know, a great injustice has been done. And as we see the brutality of the war, the displacement of peoples, the suffering, and the loss, you know, our hearts can't. How can our hearts not be moved by the tragedy that is unfolding before us? And I was thinking about, you know, as I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, in a sense, you know, Ukraine and Poland are at this moment at the center of the world's attention. And I think both countries, and when I think of countries, I think of people. Countries are people, aren't they? And both countries are showing the greatest attributes of humanity. I think for Ukrainians, they're showing such tremendous courage and determination and strength and resilience, just remarkable. And Poland is showing such generosity, such compassion, and being so giving. And I know that Poland is probably, I think, population size may be very similar to Canada. And so you've taken on a great humanitarian burden. And I'm thinking, what more, what could be greater as a people to be known for than your compassion or your courage? So, but today, of course, we also need to recognize the tremendous personal suffering that hundreds of thousands, millions of Ukrainians are going through. And so this is the topic of my webinar today. And as you can see from the title, it's called Facing Catastrophe, the Role of Anxiety, Worry, and Rumination. So let's get started. And if I can move my slide, there we go. So I start out by every webinar or workshop, I always have to say there's some disclosures. So some of the material, a lot of the material I'll be presenting has been published in workbook and therapist manuals by Guilford and New Harbinger, and I receive royalties. So let's talk for a moment about what the focus of this webinar is. And I want to kind of build the context of what I'm about to talk about and thinking about the tragedy that so many people, refugees, displaced families, displaced peoples, and so on are going through in Ukraine at this time. And certainly we would say that anxiety, worry, and rumination we need to understand these as three aspects of a complex web of thought, feeling, and behavior, which would be experienced by victims of war. So although I'm focusing on anxiety, worry, and rumination, I certainly recognize that there are also many other aspects to this complex web, if I have to call it a web of thought and feeling, reactions to trauma. And certainly that's what victims of war goes. So a complexity, these three processes, although the subject of my webinar, I'm not for a moment thinking they're the most important focus of your therapy with those who have been traumatized by war. In fact, you will want to spend a lot of attention on trauma and trauma reprocessing, depression, grief, bereavement. There are so many aspects to what war creates in individuals, and anxiety, worry, and rumination would only be part of how people react. But the other thing is, the reason I'm focusing, of course, on these three topics is because it's based on my research and clinical experience and training. And so this is where I have expertise. I don't have specialized expertise in victims of war. I know you've had other experts in this lecture series who are experts on trauma and war. And so I'm sure that they've been able to give you a lot of important information and understanding and tools to help people who are going through this terrible experience. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to try to talk about something that I'm not an expert in, but focusing on anxiety, worry, and rumination. And really, when I was preparing this webinar, I was thinking, what do we know about the treatment of anxiety and worry, let's say, that would be applicable in this context? So let's start with what I would say is the context. And when you think of war on Ukraine, and I use the war on because it is a war that has been declared or brought on the Ukrainian people. This is not a war, that's why I call it a war on Ukraine and the personal pain and suffering. I think the first thing to recognize is that, of course, for any people in any catastrophic event like this, there will be a continuum of personal loss and suffering. And I think as therapists, it's always a challenge for us to remember this. And I'm thinking probably there are maybe some Ukrainians, some people who are only maybe mildly distressed by the war. I'm not sure how many of those people there would be mild distress, but there could be, I suppose there could be some, maybe more like an identity threat or crisis. But then there's a large number of people who are at the other end of that continuum of distress, who have suffered unimaginable horror, loss, and trauma. And what we see from the news, death of loved ones, disappearance, rape, torture, bombing, severe injury, utter ruin. And that would be at the other end. And of course, in the middle, all kinds of different variations of suffering and trauma, displacement, family separation, material loss, and so on. And as therapists, I always think it's a challenge for us to be able to work with people at the point of their distress, to be able to recognize that maybe an individual who is at the milder or moderate end of the distress continuum, that they may need support and help. And of course, we would easily recognize the people at that upper end of distress and trauma need would need a lot of treatment and support and help and so on. So as therapists, we have to kind of span that continuum and take what is happening in the mild to the moderate range, take it as seriously and as we would those who are suffering greatly at the upper end of distress. So I was thinking about catastrophe because I've written about catastrophe. And if you think of cognitive behavior therapy or CBT, we talk about catastrophizing all the time. But the thing about CBT for anxiety is that most of us have worked in peacetime context. So people catastrophize over what we would say are the ordinary events of life, illness and unemployment, and let's say the possibility of death or loss or whatever. So we talk about catastrophizing. I thought, well, what about this context? What about when this really is a catastrophe? So of monumental scale. So I started by saying, okay, what's the definition of a catastrophe? And the Merriam-Webster English Dictionary defines a catastrophe as a momentous tragic event, ranging from extreme misfortune. So I think in our therapy context, let's say in peacetime therapy, a lot of times what would be a catastrophe might be misfortune of some kind. But then catastrophe goes from misfortune or extreme misfortune to utter overthrow or ruin. And I thought, well, that part of catastrophe is certainly what is happening on a large scale to so many people in Ukraine at this time. Utter overthrow or ruin. Overthrow of their lives, that is. But in CBT, we often talk about the air of catastrophizing. So there's a difference here, isn't there? That the air of catastrophizing is focusing on the worst possible outcome in an anxious situation. And then we call it, that is, you're overestimating threat and danger. But what if you're facing the worst possible outcome? What if the worst thing that you can imagine happening is happening, right? Can we even talk about an air of catastrophizing? Does even our standard traditional way of doing CBT, does it break down at this point? And so that's what I'd like to focus on today. Now, I want to just kind of remind all of us, and if you're a CBT or cognitive behavior therapist, you know this extremely well. This is the how a cognitive behavior therapist develops a therapeutic alliance. And it's the therapy style that we employ in CBT. And I remember back in the mid to late 1980s, when I first was exposed to cognitive therapy, and I spent some time at Beck's Center in Philadelphia, and this was really we spent a lot of time on the therapeutic relationship and the therapy style. And I think when people are suffering such tremendous trauma, that this way we do therapy is so important. The style is so important, if you want to call it, the approach. And what is it? Just as a reminder in CBT, well, it's collaboration. So we actively listen. We do a lot of listening. And we try to understand, join the person in the uniqueness of their experience, right? So that's really important. Go back to that continuum, and wherever the person is on that continuum, you want to be able to collaborate and actively listen. You want to be able to express warmth, empathy, and understanding as you're learning about this person's experience. And of course, it's important to validate, to acknowledge the accuracy of the person's experience. That's what validation is to be able to, as a therapist, to say, I hear what you're saying, and this is a terrible experience that you've had. And so you're collaborating in that. The second thing, of course, is not only collaboration, but it's empiricism. It's the bringing new understanding to a person's experience. That's what we want to do in CBT. It's a horrific experience that the person may have gone through, but our goal is to try to help them develop some new understanding. And we do that through hypothesis testing, but also breaking down the complexity of the experience and helping the individual to work on different aspects of whatever the experience is that they've had. The other thing we use in CBT is guided discovery. So here we use Socratic questioning to discover barriers to improve coping with real life problems. Now, I'm going to say we have to be very careful with Socratic questioning. And particularly, we have to be careful with people who are in great distress and who are suffering from trauma. The Socratic questioning must be done. It must be gentle. It must be used sparingly. One of the things I was doing as a university professor was training graduate students in cognitive behavior therapy. And when I tried to teach them about Socratic questioning, sometimes their interviews came across like a police interrogation. And I said, well, you don't have to question that vigorously. So I would say guided discovery, certainly Socratic questioning needs to be used kind of sparingly. And we want to refrain from reassurance, providing reassurance. Now, that's a very easy thing for a therapist to slip into, providing reassurance when people are suffering greatly. You just automatically want to reassure. It'll be okay. Things will be okay. The future will be brighter, and so on. I'm sure, let's say the client is a woman and her husband, her partner is back in Ukraine fighting. I'm sure he'll be okay. He will come home. That kind of reassurance is not helpful. As a therapist, you want to refrain from doing that because you don't know. You don't know the future. And where we know that therapists providing reassurance is particularly counterproductive. We know this from our treatment of people with obsessive compulsive disorder, because clients with OCD are constantly trying to get the therapist to reassure them. So it's important to refrain from that. Okay, so anxiety, let's start with that. How can we understand anxiety, particularly in this current context of the tragedy and the horrors and the trauma that people are experiencing? So this is a definition, our definition of anxiety, which I think is pretty common. Most people, I think most CBT therapists would agree to this. The only thing I would point out is, of course, is its complexity of anxiety. It involves cognition, affect, physiology, and so we often talk about anxiety as the threat mode that is activated. And of course, in the Ukrainian context, threat is everywhere. There's, every day would be an activation of the threat and danger mode. So it would be natural to see anxiety in this context. But the anxiety we're talking about is about anticipated events or circumstances. So the lectures and the training you've had on trauma would be helping individuals with, past experiences of threat and danger and loss and injury and so on. What I'm talking about here, though, is anxiety about anticipated events or circumstances. And of course, people who've been through terrible trauma and suffering, they're also anticipating events or circumstances in the future as well. Could even worse things happen, for example? So that's what we're talking about, anticipated events or circumstances. And of course, these are deemed as highly aversive, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. So that's our definition. And of course, a very simple way to think about anxiety are these three kind of core elements of anxiety: the way people think when they're anxious. So their thinking is dominated by thoughts of threat, of danger, and of course, their own personal vulnerability or helplessness. Their experience of physiological hyperarousal, heart palpitations, let's say sweating and tension. And of course, there's the coping response. And sometimes what the coping response might be avoidance, escape avoidance, the use of substances, and so on. It's interesting, though, that anxiety is not always a bad thing, right? So sometimes anxiety can be helpful, and other times it can be unhelpful. And often I use this, the example that I often use comes from everyday life. Most of our clients have experienced examinations or tests, right? And from your experience of taking tests, and maybe if you're like me, you have to think back a few decades to remember what it's like to take tests, but that it's probably helpful to have some anxiety about an examination, that the anxiety that maybe I could do poorly or even fail this exam, that anxiety about failing could be helpful if it gets you to study more and to be better prepared for the exam. That would be an example of helpful anxiety. But unhelpful anxiety would be a person who becomes so anxious about failing the exam that they can't study. Maybe they avoid studying. And so they are unprepared for the exam. So they go in and then, of course, they do poorly. So that would be unhelpful anxiety. So you can see in this slide that on my left, I guess of your right, you can see unhelpful anxiety. So what is unhelpful anxiety like? Well, if you exaggerate a bad outcome, now remember, we're talking about anticipation, the possibility of a worse outcome. We're not talking about really terrible things that have already happened. We're talking about the anticipation. So if you exaggerate, overestimate the probability of a bad outcome, if you consider the bad outcome imminent, like it's about to happen, if you tend to ignore signs of safety, comfort, wellness. In other words, you see yourself as kind of, so a common example I would have, many people with anxiety here in my practice would, and I treat veterans from the Canadian military, and some of them have been deployed overseas. And so what will happen is that they come back, a lot of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. But for example, they may have difficulty going into a supermarket and they feel a tremendous anxiety. Well, what happens is, of course, as you know, not only are they hyper-vigilant for threat, but they're also ignoring signs of safety and comfort and wellness. And that is that nobody is paying any attention to them. Everybody is getting their groceries or shopping or whatever. And so they're ignoring signs of safety. If you believe you can't cope with the situation, if you feel you're helpless, if you're vulnerable, believe that you're vulnerable, then you're more likely to have unhelpful anxiety. And then also, it's when you focus on the anxiety itself. It's kind of like you're anxious about being anxious, and you're convinced you can't tolerate the state of anxiety. That is more likely to raise your anxiety level to a level where it's unhelpful. And then, of course, you avoid, delay, or procrastinate. Now, if you look at the other side of the screen, you'll see that there are kind of the opposite, where I would just summarize the other side, that helpful anxiety often leads to problem solving and dealing with current problems or situations. So you downgrade the severity of the outcome, and you consider a bad outcome less likely. You're noticing, you're able to process and see safety and comfort around you, and you believe you're able to deal with the situation. When that happens, your anxiety level will become lower to a level that is more helpful. And if we just think about the anxious mind for a moment, this would be a classic Beck kind of view of the anxious mind, where we get overestimated threat, cognitive errors, underestimated safety, and so on. Well, what about strategies? Well, one of the first things I would say in the present context, so what I've done is in this seminar, I've picked out maybe 3 strategies, 2 to 3 strategies for anxiety, worry, and rumination, which I'm thinking might possibly be more relevant, more useful when working with Ukrainian refugees, victims of war, so that's what I've tried to do here. And I think that, those of you who with actual experience can look at it and say, yeah, I could see where that would be helpful. Or maybe you might look at it and say, nah, I don't think that's going to be so helpful. So I'll leave it up to you to whether I'm right on this or not. But one of the first strategies I would say would be to identify some anxious prediction. Now, remember, anxiety is not about the past. It's about what could happen. It's the anticipation. And so if you've had terrible things happening in your life, a lot of loss and suffering, you're probably primed to expect even greater loss and suffering. So one would be to identify the anxious prediction. And here's the example that I used, and I don't know if it might be relevant or not. You can tell me if it is. What if my husband is killed in the war? I'm thinking of maybe a woman and her children who've left, who are, refugee, and her loved ones, could be a husband, could be a brother, a father, could be all 3, right? Are left back in Ukraine. Maybe they are in the military, the civil defense, or whatever. And so the fear is about their safety. How could I cope with the loss? And let's assume, and I said in the brackets, let's assume that husband, the father, brother, is still alive. So it's a prediction. And let's say she says, well, I think there's an 80% probability it's going to happen as the war ability increases, and of course they would estimate a very, very severe event, 10 out of 10. So as a therapist, what you want to do is when you tell yourself there's a high probability that husband, brother, boyfriend, father will be killed, and it's the most severe outcome you can imagine, does this make you feel more or less anxious? And there is the key to CBT. It's not that there's anything wrong with the person's thinking, and it's understandable why you would be thinking this way, let's say as a refugee. Perfectly understandable. But it's kind of it's a question of what's the effect of the thinking? Does this way of thinking make you feel more anxious or less anxious? Now, I'm sure the client's going to say, well, it makes me feel more anxious. And then that opens the door. Is there a way to think about this terrible situation that would make you less anxious? So that would be strategy one. Strategy two would be to identify vulnerability cognitions, okay? So let's say the anxious concern here is the person is refugee, they're homeless, everything back home is destroyed. I've watching lots of news coverage, just appalled at the physical destruction of cities like Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities. It's heartbreaking. And imagine, I mean, we look at these destroyed buildings, but these are people's homes, these are where they live. They've invested so much and it's all gone. It's destroyed. Everything back home is destroyed. So that's the anxious trigger, let's say. And let's say the helplessness thinking, I'll never be able to rebuild my life. I'm too old to start over again. Maybe this is because I'm in my 60s now and I'm always thinking about, well, if you're in your 20s or 30s, you think about you rebuild. What about older Ukrainians, those who have, in their 60s, 70s, and so on? How can they start over, right? So I'm too old to start over. That's the helplessness thinking. But what would be a desired way to cope? And maybe the client says, well, I'd like to believe that my future will be better. I'd like to believe that I can rebuild my life and that maybe in the future, when this is over, I will have some moments of joy. I'd like to believe that. So the therapist would say, what's the greatest tragedy you've had to overcome in the past? And it's obviously not going to be as tragic as the current situation. But, before the war, people would have had probably tragedies in their life, family members that have been lost, certainly maybe less severe and less, let's say, global or not global, but certainly widespread, less widespread than the war is. But, they faced some tragedies. So how did you overcome that in the past? And then asking them, exploring with the client, do you know anyone with a similar situation who you think coped well? And I'm sure with all of the refugees and all of the tremendous humanitarian work that you're all doing now, I mean, there will be a variety of responses and a variety of ways in which people are coping with this terrible situation. And so getting your client to look at the fact that there are these different ways of coping, and then what did they do and so on. So what you're trying to do is help the client begin to think about this terrible situation in terms of having some scope to it, some range of coping possibilities, and that there's not just one way to see, to react to. So that would be, and a third strategy, so cognitive interventions. Well, what would be the cognitive? Well, you know the cognitive interventions, right? So this is cognitive restructuring, right? So evidence gathering, cost benefit analysis. What is the advantage or disadvantage of making that anxious prediction? Are there any cognitive errors that are not particularly helpful? And what's an alternative way to think about the anxious concern? How could, it's a terrible situation. It's an awful, terrible suffering. What might be a way of thinking about this that would be more helpful? And of course, that needs to be done collaboratively. Absolutely. You can't just impose some kind of, solution, let's say, or way of thinking on the client, but must be done collaboratively. So the anxious concern, let's say an example that I'll be alone, separated from family, and with no means of survival, right? So what you're trying to do, let's say if it's something like that, that's that prediction, is that you're using these strategies to help people arrive at a less anxious, more helpful way of thinking, turning down that threat mode thinking to a certain degree. And finally, you want to identify, counter, and reduce, I call it anxiety accelerant. Not sure how that's going to translate, but accelerant, which is kind of like if you have a fire and you pour gas on the fire, it's an accelerant. It makes the fire more intense. So how do you, so as a therapist, you want to identify, counter, and reduce responses that make the anxiety worse. So escape avoidance patterns, that's well known to all of us, that tends to make anxiety worse. Safety seeking behavior, where basically these are responses that people use maybe to feel some, grasping for some sense of safety or calm or comfort, but they may be unhelpful ways. I'm thinking of using drugs or alcohol or something like that may not be particular. That would be ineffective coping, I should say. Safety seeking might be clinging to other people, for example, in an unhealthy way. The note here is you want to collaboratively work on different coping responses that might increase anxiety in the short term, but reduce its persistence and long-term intensity. So we know, what I'm trying to say there is that we know in CBT for anxiety, often our interventions will lead to a short-term increase in anxiety, but they're therapeutic and helpful in the long term in terms of reducing the persistence of the intensity of the anxiety. And this is, I think this is my last slide on anxiety, and then we'll talk about worry. But this is a slide on recovery-orientated cognitive therapy. So Dr. Beck and I are co-authored a book called The Anxiety and Worry Workbook. And we're in the process of working on a second edition, and which is now pretty well completed. In that, unfortunately, Dr. Beck passed away in last November. And so he passed away before the book the revision was completed. But I'm saying that because what we did is we incorporated some ideas of what he calls recovery-orientated cognitive therapy. So this is a recovery-orientated exposure plan. And, exposure is an important part of CBT for anxiety. And I was thinking, how do you use exposure in the context of people who have already and are currently experienced such terrible trauma? I mean, you don't want to add more burden to them and more suffering than they're already experiencing. So this is why I like this recovery orientated approach to exposure. And I think it works, it could be quite relevant for the clients you're working with at the moment, refugees. So one of the things you do with recovery oriented exposure is you start out by establishing an anxiety recovery goals, or it could be more than one goal, it could be several goals. What would you like to do but can't because of high anxiety? And you try to be specific. So in my context, working with veterans and those with post-traumatic stress, they might say, well, I would like to be able to drive my car without having road rage and, kind of losing control or so on. Or I'd like to be able to go into a grocery store without having a panic attack. Or, so you try to be specific. What would you like to be able to do but can't do because you have such high anxiety at the moment? The second thing you want to do then is identify healthy responses. You want to identify healthy responses to tolerate anxiety. Work on ways of acting that improve tolerance of anxiety. Like you could work with a client on structuring some exposure experiences. So trying to build up some, let's say, resilience, some strength to deal with anxiety related to the anticipation of something worse happening in the future. And then thirdly, you want to work on more effective coping strategies to identify ways of healthy coping with problems that trigger high anxiety. So you can see that it's exposure from the point of view that you're actually working at an experiential level, but you're defining it differently in terms of goals, the achievement, particularly in the first, actually in all three, you're working on helping the client achieve goals for, recovery from anxiety and so on. Now, I've got a note here and it says, exposure to anxiety-provoking situation is a core element of CBT for anxiety, but in the present, I would use exposure sparingly. If used, it should be highly specific, and you certainly don't want to overload clients who are already burdened by huge life events. So let's a quick, let me see, how are we doing for time? I've got about 15 minutes, so I will be a little quicker on the worry. So what worry is about the what ifs. Definition of worry, I think I don't need to go over this. You probably know this quite well. And so, as you know, from the definition of worry, there are 6 features that we work on when it comes to excessive worry. One is tolerance of uncertainty, since worry is always about the future. And Michel Dugas and others have noted that the inability to tolerate uncertainty is a core feature of worry. There is that sense of uncontrollability. Person starts to worry, they can't stop. It's always about threat. They have ineffective coping or control strategies. Adrian Wells and others have talked about positive and negative beliefs about worry. And you can see worry as a failure to failed problem. So, this is a little kind of self-regulatory model of worry. And you can think of what I see worry is often triggered by an intrusive thought. People don't say, well, I think it's time to worry. So I'll, and certainly in the present context with working with refugees and others, I mean, there's a huge number of issues, concerns they would have, they could worry about. But I think even in this context, people don't want to worry. It just, the thoughts pop in their mind, maybe triggered by something that's happened around, but it's an intrusive thought. And there's two ways that this control can, two ways this can go. So if you have that in worry-related intrusive thought, and it's about something that's highly significant, but then you doubt whether you're able to cope with it. You try hard to deal with the worry, so you put a lot of mental control, effort into it. You're paying attention to it. You may have other negative thoughts come in. Of course, anxiety is elevated and you continue to worry. If you have a worry intrusion and it's significant, but you think, you know what, I can deal with this. I have a plan in place. I know what I need to do. Your mental control effort goes down. You pay less attention to the worry, and you can get the other distracting cognitions can enter your mind, and the anxiety and worry ceases or reduces. So strategy one, let's say, with worry is to help people make a distinction between, and Bob Leahy talks about this in his Worry, the Cure for Worry, his book on entitled The Cure for Worry, or The Worry Cure, excuse me. So the first strategy, is the worry realistic or imaginative? And you see here the characteristics of a realistic worry on my left, your right, and characteristics of imaginative worry on the other side. And you can see that imaginative worry deals with implausible things, what ifs, and so a lot of times the people I work with who have excessive or pathological worry, they're worried about things that could happen, but it could happen, they may never happen. So for example, there's a research study by Borkovic and colleagues many years ago, and they came up with something like 80% of the things that people worry about never happen, or, if they do happen, the person is much better at coping with it than they ever thought they could, right? That would be imaginative worry. But you see, in the present context, working with refugees from Ukraine, and so Ukrainian refugees, a lot of their worries are realistic. They're dealing with real life problems. They have some influence over the outcome and so on. So the first strategy we want to know is, as a therapist, am I dealing with a realistic worry, something that's happening in the here and now, a problem that the person is facing in the here and now? Or is this something that they're imagining could happen in the future? And that'd be more an imaginative worry. The second strategy is you want to compare when worry succeeded versus when it failed to reach for a solution. So you could ask for examples when worry led to a useful solution, and other times when worry was unproductive. And then you can help through the collaborative therapeutic style, so the client can begin to see what are the differences between problem solving when it's successful and problem solving when it's unsuccessful. And I like this comparison process because it helps to remind the client, look, you can be a productive worrier, you can be a good problem solver sometimes, but in other situations, maybe not as good at problem solving. Right? So it kind of empowers the individual to think, okay, I have this ability. What I've got to do is to be able to apply that ability in this other context. So comparing differences between when problem solving is successful versus unsuccessful, you can then work with the client to discover what different strategies they employed to solve the problem when it was unsuccessful. What were you doing to try to solve the problem? And is that the reason that it was unsuccessful? And then again, what the client thinks went wrong with unsuccessful problem solving. So the reason that I pulled out this strategy number 2, is I'm thinking that a lot of the worry you're going to see in your clients is realistic worry. And that the best therapeutic strategy for realistic worry is based on problem solving. And so that's why I've emphasized problem solving here. And this kind of work could lead into exploring with the client what his or her beliefs are about worry. A third strategy is, of course, discovering the feared catastrophe, and remember, it's an anticipated catastrophe, not what has already happened. So you might have clients write their catastrophic narrative. Again, I would be careful in using this with people who have experienced so much catastrophe in the past. But if you think about it this way, they're replaying this catastrophe in their mind. So it's by getting them to write it down, you're kind of objectifying what they're already thinking about. And then you can probe with the client, asking these questions. What do you imagine caused this catastrophe? When you're thinking about what could happen, this worst thing that could happen, what do you think would cause this worst thing to happen? If it did happen, how would it affect your mood and your health and your social relations? You want to explore what are you telling yourself is the likelihood of that catastrophe happening, and do you think you could bear it? And do you imagine having some control over it, or how you would cope with it? And then finally, and this is, I think, a really important one, is probing and exploring with the client, how would your life be changed or ruined by the catastrophe? And as I said in the bottom, you've got to be careful in using this approach with individuals who are already overloaded with loss and trauma. And then the final strategy is, once you've got that the feared catastrophe narrative, then to help them with response prevention of unhelpful worry control strategies. And here's a list of them, which I'm sure are quite familiar to most of you, maybe all of you. You want to discourage avoidance and compulsive checking and reassurance seeking and so on. In other words, you want to help the client to engage in healthy problem solving activities or strategies, I should say. And yeah, these are just some examples of some positive and negative worry beliefs. And again, you could use the traditional cognitive restructuring to help people what should we say, to reformulate or their beliefs about worry. Oh, we're almost out of time. Let me see, rumination. So I'm thinking that rumination could be a problem with many of your clients, in that this is where you're thinking about past events, maybe past decisions that have been made. That would probably be more regret, I guess, but rumination about past experiences and why did it happen. And I'm going to just leave you with these slides because I think they're self-explanatory. A lot of this work has been done by Ed Watkins. He's done some great work on cognitive therapy or cognitive behavior therapy for rumination. So there's a definition of rumination, and that's kind of breaking down what rumination is all about. And I've given you an example. Why was my home bombed, destroyed, but not others? As I look at the news coverage, and you'll see, an apartment building, let's say, that's been hit by a missile, and then one beside it isn't. And I know in working with veterans that this was always a great difficulty for them, that a comrade or a buddy would be injured or harmed and they would not be. And why was that? And how is it possible, and reconciling that? And so I imagine this is happening over and over and over and over again, hundreds, thousands of times in the Ukraine And people are left with this question, and this would fuel rumination. One of the things that I do with rumination is getting the person to ask the question, what have they learned from ruminating? And then this is the most important one, which is trying to help the person shift from why, getting stuck in rumination, trying to understand the past, to problem solving the present. There's my summary. I think cognition matters even with real life horrors. The way we think is still important. Imagining even greater future calamity increases anxiety and worry. And our goal is to shift from unhealthy to more healthy forms of worry. And if you're interested in more information, I have some resources there. And I think the negative workbook is in Polish now, been translated into Polish. So thank you. The end. And I'll stop sharing.
Well, what's a shame that time is flying so fast. It would be really so important to continue, David, because you have raised so many important issues. How we can practice CBT, but how we have to be very cautious in how we're practicing it in the current situation. And this is a incredible skill that we have to learn, and adjust all of this, what we know and what's been very helpful in so many different situations, but not these situations. These situations require really special amount of awareness, delicacy, but also skillfulness.
Yeah.
So this was a fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
CBT practitioners, honestly, I don't know what other people think about it. This is my personal view. But certainly this is what we need. You've shown us a very specific ways to adjust what we know, what we practice, to the very sensitive situation that we have to deal with. And it's important.
In putting this webinar together, I was thinking that it's kind of, I should be listening to you and to many of the mental health professionals maybe who will be listening to this webinar, because you are the experts in this. You are the ones, you are on the ground, you are having the experience, from your own experience what is helpful and what is not helpful. And I think with any webinar, any presenter, you kind of listen to it and you say, okay, what can I take away? What is useful? Nah, that's not so useful. I think he missed the mark there. That's not quite right. But yeah, maybe this part, this is a useful, and sometimes it's just a reminder too, isn't it? It's just kind of like, oh yeah, that's probably right. I need to do that. Yeah.
Reminder and the reinforcement that yes, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's also very important.
Yeah.
Yes. So honestly, this has been really very helpful, because it also shows us CBT practitioners that we have tools. We have really very useful tools to help these people and get active.
Yeah.
Get involved with this extra sensitivity that you're teaching us to take into account. We can really make a difference.
Yeah. It's one other thing, if I could just mention this. Often, I don't know, I've had about almost 40 years of, in the profession, we'll say. I like to tell people I started very young, but I didn't. I started same age everybody else did. But, sometimes you'll have a client with so many problems and so many life crises, right? That you just feel overwhelmed by it all. You know, where do I start? What do I do? And, you know, even at when I was doing my postdoc at Beck's, you know, at the center in Philadelphia, and understood we would have clients who really had very difficult life circumstances, right? And you would sometimes, the complexity would be so enormous. But what I like about CBT, it says, okay, let's organize this a bit. Let's have a case formulation. I didn't talk about that, but that's a big one. Case formulation, okay? Let's try to understand this, and then let's work at it one bit at a time. Let's work at it in an organized way. And I'm going to start here because I think this is what's important for us to do right now. And so, you know, you start there and you do it. And that must be happening time and time again with your work with refugees who've had so much loss, so much trauma, so much suffering in their life that you might like, where do we even begin? How can, maybe we should just give up almost in a sense, but no, in CBT we say, don't give up, right? It's, you know, fortifying coping strategies, helping people to think about their situation differently in a more helpful way. So I think a great challenge, and I applaud you. I think it's just wonderful, unbelievably wonderful, the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Thank you for your kind words. Definitely, it's a very needed work. It's really very important work. Yeah. And there is not much research on this. So it's really a very, sensitive situation still. We really have to act thinking seriously how to not harm, first of all, but also how to share our psychological, psychotherapeutic skills so it really brings the most help to other people. So David Clark, we shall be in touch.
Okay.
You certainly have, we certainly have a lot in common. I also learned CBT in mid-80s.
Wow.
But big names, not Professor Beck, but not Tim Beck, but few other wonderful people in London. Yeah. So it's wonderful that you also, and I always emphasize this, all of these principles and ways of working have been really very helpful, have proven proven to be very helpful over these few decades. Yes. And it's really worth doing this because it can really make a change too.
Right.
So we shall continue with this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for being with us. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye now.
And we shall be in touch.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.